And hello. My name is Alex, pronouns are he, him, and I am the co-editor of the Norwich Radical. And I am joined today by my co-editor Rowan, who we're going to go introduce next, and the co-founders of the Norwich Radical, Cadi and Chris. Rowan, would you like to say something about yourself?
Yeah, hi, hello. My name is Ryan Gavin. I'm the other current co-editor of the Norwich Radical, formerly the student editor. Been with the Radical since 2016 in official capacity, but I wrote some things for us before then. And we're here to talk about the 10-year anniversary of the Radical, which we're celebrating this month, which is exciting. And I guess we should have our two co-founders introduce themselves, so I'll throw to Caddy.
Hi, yeah, Cadi, lovely to be here. Can't believe it's been 10 years since we co-founded the Norwich Radical in 2014. I hung around as a co-editor until 2019, which now feels like a very long time ago. And yeah, really excited to have a good old chat and reminiscence. So, Chris, over to you.
No, so I'm Chris. With Caddy sat down and decided to set this old thing up in 2014. I don't have the memory that the others do, so I have literally no idea when I stopped co-editing the website, but it was probably 2018-ish. Someone will correct me. Yeah, ably handed over to the fantastic co-editors that we have today.
I have a weird thing like suggesting 2016, but it might have been 2018.
It was,
I
yeah.
think it was 2017 because that was the second war of words, and it was that particular one after it that Chris and I sat Alex down in a corner and essentially begged Alex to co-edit with me. So I feel it was 2017.
Okay, but we are getting ahead of ourselves because we are going to start at the very beginning. After both Caddy and Chris have kind of suggested how it happened. And I know, Rowan, I think you've heard one version of the story. I know I've heard at least three versions of the story. Um,
Want to hear
but
what you think happened?
no,
Let's
no, no,
let's not
no.
bother with what we think happened. What do you think happened?
All I remember is something about vegan ice cream or some kind of vegan dessert and a floor. Oh no, it
Yeah,
was vegan lassie.
no. Yeah, I mean, you're
No.
kind of roughly in the area. The components are there, but there are some structural elements
Yeah.
missing.
Okay, so
We
how about Caddy and Chris? You tell us how the Norwich Radical was founded in 2014.
I mean, my memory is that Chris and I were sat on my bedroom floor in my student house at the time, and it was a tofu cheesecake. I discovered that you can make cheesecake out of silken tofu, and it slightly changed my life anyway. I don't know about Chris's, but it changed my life because it was over one of those that Chris and I were like, we have an idea. Although actually, it was Chris saying he had an idea, an incredibly amazing idea, threw it at me, and I realised that practically it was probably going to be me that was going to land it in terms of the container, i.e., having a site and figuring out how we were going to do this. But yeah, Chris had this idea about let's do something, like when you're coming out of university and got this energy, but it also feels kind of a little bit like this kind of cliff edge as well in terms of what's next. And at that particular time, I mean, now is very much the same too, but we were living and experiencing a very distressing and frustrating and infuriating world where there was a lack of progressive for
Such a good
people
thing
to
that's not the
put.
case anymore, huh?
Yeah, and yeah, we wanted to do something about it, but it was yeah the power of that a tofu cheesecake. That's what started it in my memory. Anyway,
And
that is
Chris,
10
so
years ago.
Do you remember like where the idea came from, other than the general environment of everything?
so I think that the first thing I should say is that on the tofu question, I remember it being two courses of tofu. I remember there being like a tofu stir fry arrangement as the main, followed by tofu cheesecake. So in many ways, we were the original tofu eating wokarati. Many moons before that phrase got popularized. But to answer your question, rather than what I decided to talk about, where the idea came from, I guess. So this was, I think, May 2014. The context, I guess, in which Cad and I knew each other was we were both students at UEA from 2011 to 2014. We'd both been involved in various campaign groups at the university and outside wider Norwich, including, we were involved with the Green Party. We ran the UEA and Greens together, and we were involved in groups like People and Planet. And we both just ran to be sabbatical officers in the Students' Union. One of us was successful, one of us wasn't. But at that time, it was clear that there was, as Cadi said, we'd been involved in lots of infrastructure at UEA. And it was clear to me that there was lots of scope for bringing the energy and excitement and organising that we were doing as students into a wider space. And I think reflecting back, there was a number of things that were going on locally that I thought that a alternative, explicitly left-wing media organisation and group could do. At this time we had a student newspaper that was, fairly standard, run-of-the-mill, not particularly progressive. We also had the launch of another publication on campus called The Tab, which was about as reactionary as it was possible to get. We had a particularly ineffective and reactionary local newspaper, and what I guess we were thinking was we want to take and harness the energy of the campaign groups we were a part of, the organising structures we were involved in and set up, and offer a space for progressives and leftists to come together, using the written word as a medium of driving political change, in a context where, locally, the media landscape was pretty shit. Sorry, I haven't been told whether I can swear or not. Apologies if I'm not allowed to. We can cut that if I'm not. And nationally, obviously, the context was, as we all know, what the media landscape was and is. So I guess that's where the seeds of it came from. And also, I just wanted to spend more time hanging out with one of my best friends, Cadi, and this was an excuse to do that from a purely selfish position.
Forcing people into stressing about whether we're going to be able to pay for a domain is the best way of hanging out with your friends. You heard it here first.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do have a lot of memories about some of that really core, granular things when you start doing, yes, we've got this idea, we want to be an alternative, it's creating a space, we'll bring people together, and then we need a website, we need a domain, and we need an address to link this to, and just all those little components. So yeah, it was a really wonderful learning opportunity at the start as well. Like, how do you take that idea and put it into practice outside of what are the sort of usual structures and frameworks of, university societies, etc. Like, what does it look like when you put it out into the rest of the world? Really. And Chris, you are right. There was, I believe, I kind of created tofu sort of slabs/steaks or marinated for quite a while. So if I correct, it was a 2-course tofu journey for us.
It was a tofu.
Yes, a tofu.
Not sure. So yeah, I think that's, I guess what I'm interested in to follow up on that is then, so you've got the idea about putting an actual website together and doing the practical side of it. What was the initial moves you made to get other people involved in being interested in writing stuff, and under what was the kind of pitch to those original writers? I guess I'm curious about. Do you remember?
I'm trying to remember. I feel like to begin with, we went to people that we knew. So people that we were friends with. So, for example, I do remember us approaching Alex, and at the time, Alex is still, that's still part of his profession, his career now, but was asking around kind of translation. And I think there was this idea of creating a platform, but also wanting to have a space where different voices were being heard, and voices that don't often have spaces. So when Alex started with us, it was around translating Italian female poets into English. So some of these people, their work had never been translated into English before. So, what that meant, as an act in and of itself of bringing different voices to an audience. So yeah, it was approaching people that we knew, that we had been involved in various of, our kind of political and social justice related experiences at university, and then also putting a call out saying to people using social media, is anybody frustrated at what was happening in the media, the news, experiences, etc. Is there something you want to talk about? Giving people that space and opportunity. Like Chris was saying, we wanted to galvanize the energy that was there, and it picked up a natural momentum in and of itself. Different people came forward. Some people really cared about the arts. Some people cared more about local or national politics. We were at a time where the arts and humanities were being, well, still are, but at the time were being really, kind of chased, etc. And there were a lot of individuals that wanted to talk to that matter. There's also things happening in Norwich. So bearing in mind, we kind of started as, very hyper local in terms of the people that were writing for us. It's people living in the city, so talking about issues that were happening in Norwich as well. But it started from who we knew, and then gained kind of a momentum from there, as well as us. Back in the day, we do rounds of recruitments, because we also had to manage it ourselves. So, trying to encourage regular contributors so that we knew we had a kind of steady schedule. So we put rounds of recruitments out, and we sort of focused in different areas. At the time we had different sections, whether it was arts or kind of some sort of perspectives, national, etc. So we put different rounds of recruitment out, do targeting in that sense. But it was a lot of trial and error, and approaching people around election times, things like that, looking at what do we want to cover, what were stories that we wanted to put a spotlight on, and reaching out to people who we thought could write or would have an interesting view or voice on that subject as well.
Yeah, I guess I think the only things I'd add really is one of the things that we as Cadi said, we a lot of it was just basically asking our mates. But some of our mates, we were very effective at choosing people who would go on to be brilliant media stars and writers. So two of the earliest contributors that we had as part of the team was Ella Gilbert, for example, who is now a leading climate change YouTuber, regularly appears in on broadcaster and that sort of stuff. We also had Elle Folan, writing regularly at the start of things. Elle is now the person behind Stats for Lefties, a regular contributor to Novara Media, other spaces. A lot of it was just basically just in the same way that Cadi and I set it up, because we've been organising together. We approached the people that we've been organising with and campaigning with, who we knew and trusted the politics of, and also knew were shit hot writers who could produce really compelling articles. I think the other thing is one of the things that we, the time in which we set it up is an important bit of context for the kind of nature of the content that we were putting out. So this is sort of 2014-15 is the early days of the publication. What was going on quite a lot in the student world then was basically a massive fucking culture war. Now we're seeing that in our national politics now, but it was there on campuses at the time, and we were quite intentional about taking a particular side on that in that culture war, which is basically on the side of liberation against oppression, and we intentionally were seeking out writers who had who were able to write about those issues, particularly, trans rights, decolonization, migration, from a position of experience, lived experience, and putting it in the context of wider politics. And so we were intentional about finding people like that. We had a specific section within the publication that was specifically designed to be around liberation politics, and that was kind of crucial to what we sought to do.
And it was one of the reasons that we intentionally created, not just, the container of the Norwich Radical, but also, why Chris and I wrote a founding statement where we recognise that we are individuals, but we also, were a collective, and we had a series of values. Because for us, it wasn't just about, we're a bunch of students, graduates, let's create a little publication. It was about what we stood for, what we believed in, and the people that we wanted to kind of bring together, introduce to each other, have a space for those voices and experiences. What things did we want to put our lives on? So it was really important for us to take a very particular and strong stand as to what we believed in, that at the time was very it was contrasting to what else was out there. Chris kind of mentioned the tab, for example. That's one of my strongest memories of just kind of how clickbaity it was, and reactionary. And it was like, no, we wanted to create a progressive and sort of decent space that we really believed in. So for us, it was as much about writing and the art that we put as it was about the social change that we believed in, and 10 years later have careers in now as well.
It's one thing that I just noticed going through the back end. The founding statement was published on May 22, 2014 at 7:46 p.m. and it has not been touched since. It is the... And it already mentions that we had over 1,000 articles, and this was like, what, 10 days in from publication? It was incredible.
I think we may have touched that since, Alex, in fact. But,
I remember...
say anything here. Oh, it was last edited 7 years ago, but we're going to ignore that.
Well, that's it. So I remember editing it in the days running up to the second War of Words in 2017, because that's when we hit our 1,000th article. And I remember being like, we've hit 1,000, that's 1,000 and bit more, like, that's 1,000 more pieces of progressive writing, art, voices, etc. that's out there. It was, in the run up to our second conference. And it was, I mean, I have no idea what you guys are on now, but, in 2017, getting to 1,000 just felt incredible in terms of, the voices that we've been able to hold a space for, what we've been able to comment on. I mean, in 2017, flipping Osborne, sitting MP, just became editor of the, Evening Standard. We were in a space where, and still are, where majority of our media is controlled by like 3 main companies. It was just all these kind of pressure points and, frustrations on a national landscape. And I was like, we're 1,000 articles in, and we still need this alternative. We still need the Norwich Radical, but 10 years later, we still need things like the Norwich Radical. But yes, I remember editing it in 2017 because I was like, we have to mention that we've got to 1,000.
And we are now 70 articles away from being 2,000.
Fantastic. So 0.
20 by my count.
I'm looking at the published ones, not the drafts.
Hidden.
I want to look at the drafts. What's the stuff that never got published?
I mean, that's an interesting thing that we can maybe talk about as we go on to talk about the further history of the Radical in terms of how the publishing model has changed over time. Because 1,000 in 3 years, and then slightly less than 1,000 in the subsequent 7 years. So things have definitely changed in terms of how we publish things and the volume of stuff we publish, which will be interesting to talk about as well. But since you mentioned it, Cadi, we should probably talk about War of Words, which is for those that don't know, the conference that the Radical ran for, I want to say 4 years. It was 16 through 19, right? I remember, and I suppose Alex and I could talk about how we got involved as well. So I was a student. I was a first-year student when you two were final-year students and eating tofu and coming up with great ideas. And I probably just met you both through the Young Greens, I think, at the time. Then I wrote the first thing I wrote for the Radical was a kind of recap on a march that happened in London, which was, I think, a People's Assembly march, if I remember right. Let me see, what was it? I've got it here somewhere. It was the People's Climate March in London in September 2014, just around the start of my second year of university. Which was basically, I was going on this demo on the coach with the UEA folks, and I remember Chris asked me, we need somebody to write about this. Do you want to write about it? And so I did.
It's just kind of the modus operandi of the entire thing.
Yeah, the time-honoured tradition of just asking your mates to do you a favour.
Yeah. And then I wrote one
on
other
a bus on the way or on the way back from a demo.
I wrote one other thing in 2014, and then the next thing I wrote, apparently, is that I interviewed Natalie Bennett a year and a half later. Which seems like a bit of a jump, having previously had 2 written credits to my name published, but that is what I did, apparently. But yes, in 2016, I was a final year student. You guys, as part of the Radical, were starting War of Words. So I guess I'm curious again where that idea came from and how that ball kind of got rolling.
It was probably my fault. I don't really remember I don't know, Caddy, whether you have a better memory on this than me, but um, I'm guessing it was my fault.
I wasn't going to sling you under the bus, but seeing as you did it for yourself, it was probably you. I mean, I don't remember a specific kind of moment of like aha in the same way that I know how the Radicals started, but I think for us, it was a natural kind of progression through the momentum that we were building. I mean, you touched on Rowan, the fact obviously the Radical has changed in terms of structure, etc. That the pace that we were working at back then is, would not have been tenable to keep it going, considering, we were doing this in our free time around, the work that we were doing, etc. It really, we still had, youthful student energy, graduate energy, etc. Like it was definitely a momentum that wouldn't and couldn't kind of sustain itself for 10 years in that particular guise, right? For us, it is a natural progression from what we were doing, which is, we were having these voices coming together online in terms of sharing a platform. Chris has, had and still has, with his work now, an awful lot of connections in other progressive media spaces. I had quite a lot, and Alex as well, quite a lot of academic contacts at the time. I remember bringing one of my old literature professors who brought a great guy called David Breakspear, who somebody that had been in the prison system, and the two of them were basically talking about prison reform, and it was just the weird things that you can kind of bring together. But I think there's a natural progression for us to have a physical space. Wanting to create a physical conference, bring people together, generate that kind of energy that is sometimes missing if things are just happening online. I mean, back then, we weren't, it's not like post-COVID, we weren't using Zoom to hold online, events. It was articles get published, but there was something around the edges which we wanted to explore, which is what happens when you actually get people together and offer something in Norwich. It wasn't something that was being offered in Norwich, or really anywhere, in terms of bringing people together for a platform and discussion. I feel it was a natural progression. I can't personally remember what was we have to have a kind of conference moment. I feel it was about, there's so much energy here. What would happen if we created a physical space, made, Chris and I, when we started the Norwich Radical, it was as much about the collective and a movement as it was around a website and articles and, kind of comments and pieces of art being published, etc. So I think this was part of the movement. I had a part of movement building and creating conversation.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to break my memory, but like Caddy has, described that very, very eloquently, as if it was all very intentional and we had a real clear idea of what we were doing. And I'm not sure that's true.
I remember
I think
being in the organizing meetings for that particular conference, because I think it was...
They were chaos, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it all went... It was surprising how smoothly not surprising, it was reinvigorating how smoothly everything went after the chaos that was the organization.
If I remember rightly,
people willingly showed up, and there were a lot of people that first event, and it was completely new. No one had done anything like it before, and now it's a regular occurrence in the UK media landscape to have something like it. Like Rowan, I know you've been you've been involved in the organization of similar events.
I was just going to say, if I remember rightly, I'm just trying to, I don't know whether I'll be able to find this now, but if I remember rightly, I think we did the first event on 400 quid. We crowdfunded literally 400 quid to run that event, and had this ridiculous lineup of speakers. And Caddy said it's because I had connections. I didn't have connections. I was just a blagger. I didn't know the general secretary of the NUJ, but we managed to get her along the first time. We've got MPs and loads of other stuff. Yeah.
It is yet again,
It was.
Chris, your ability to convince people to do things. I can't even, I'd like to think ethically we did cover everybody's expenses
You did.
in year one. But that may have had to be from some coins down the back of the sofa as well in order to actually cover transport. But yeah, I think you've commented on it there, Alex. I think I was just really in awe that people wanted to and people turned up and people got also like it's Norwich, with like the east of England. It's notoriously difficult to get to. Just the sheer concern of would people get there on a train? Would we actually have the speakers on the day? But people came all the way to Norwich. I think one year various people crashed on different floors of people. I think somebody might have crashed on one of your floors, Rowan. I can't remember, but we
Oh,
just. Yeah, now we
Probably
go,
me one year, actually.
probably like yeah, probably ice one year, but yeah, I think looking back, I can't really remember how it all started, but what I do remember was that people said yes, people turned up, and it got bigger the next year. Do you know what I mean? There was an appetite for it, and I think, whilst we can't fully remember where it came from, and no, it wasn't, it was not slim at all, Chris, you're correct. It was, pulling things together, but we knew it was something, we believed it was something there was an appetite for, and I think we proved ourselves right with that one.
Yeah, I have some more memories of the 2017 conference, which I was more involved in organising. I mean, I think that's the one where with the picture of the four of us at the end, all in our Norwich Radical t-shirts, doing various silly poses. Yeah, exactly. Which I think the four of us were sort of the organisers of that event, basically, and which was maybe the moment where all four of us were kind of relatively equally involved, where we sort of all overlapped the most at that period in the history of the publication. But yeah, I remember, I think it was for that one that Adam Ramsey stepped on my sofa, famously of Open Democracy.
Alan
figure in
Ramsey, who
alternative media,
famously
so
made up the topic of his panel the moment that he started the panel.
Yeah, I was going to say that literally the night before we were in the Playhouse in Norwich, and he said, "Chris,
Yeah.
you've asked me to talk on something. I don't really fancy that. I think people would want to hear more about dark money and Brexit and my work delving into that." And then the following day, he at the start of the panel was like, "Right, I'm going to do a straw poll. Who wants to hear about?" I think I'd asked him to do something really boring, like reporting on devolved institutions, and he was like, "Who wants to hear about that? Or who wants to hear about how the DUP have been funneling dark money into the Brexit referendum campaign, and it's all a plot from money laundered imperialists?" And obviously the audience was right and chose that
When you
session
put it like
instead.
that.
But that's the kind of scrappiness that was involved at some points in that event.
Yeah, and I remember that conversation in the Playhouse, and he'd just literally been down in, I think maybe even on his way up, he'd been down in Ely, trying to get to the address of one of these corporations that supposedly existed, which was just an empty house in Ely that he discovered. So yeah, hearing about that reporting kind of live, as it were, as part of that event was really, really interesting and fun. And I have fond memories of some of the
part
other
of it
panels
though,
as
right?
well.
Like it was scrappy and it wasn't slick, but what we were bringing to the table in terms of conversation really in people, and because we weren't slick, I think it almost helped us in some ways that people wanted to help us out. They wanted to kind of be a part of it. Were very generous with their times. We paid for people's travel, but we weren't in a position to pay for their actual speaking time. And that those were conversations we had with people. But yeah, folk wanted to help us out. So we owe an awful lot to the people that turned up and wrote for the Radical and supported the Radical, and especially in those early days, when pretty much it was just, look, we can give you a better platform. If you want to be kind of a part of what we're doing, and it was a lot down to the just general good grace and, wanting to be a part of something, of people that we had backs with.
Yeah, and I think as well it was I think looking back on it in terms of the history of alternative media in this country, you guys and we eventually hit on something that was really being hit, as you say, was needed, and a lot of other people will recognise it at around the same time. People like Novara Media was starting up at around the same time. And like the Alex alluded to earlier, the Media Democracy Festival, which I was involved in organising last year, which is run by the Media Reform Coalition, was started up around that same time. 2015 might have been the first one. And then there was the Canary later on, which was founded, as you might guess by the name, from people who were connected to Norwich, but went on to be much, should we say, more viral than we ever were, and an important player in the alternative media space.
They just made a lot of people angry a lot of the time, usually for good reasons, but they were just really good at getting people really fired up about stuff.
Yeah, I worked for them for 18 months and I took great pride in that.
Yeah. I remember you left the Norwich Radical to go to the Canary, and it was like, this is betrayal, but also it makes sense, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's something else we can maybe talk about, is that we're a volunteer team, right? We always have been. I think it's fair to say nobody in the Radical has ever been paid for any of the work they do, and we don't necessarily wear that as a badge of honour. We would love to be able to pay people, but equally, as we found at the time, well, at the time I think it was much more important to all of us to make the stuff, and as you say, Cadi, add another 1,000 progressive articles, in the world on the internet coming out of the UK than there were before. That was much more important than kind of monetizing it, trying to make it into something that would be financially sustainable or sort of a business model of any kind. And that's something we've explored several times over the years in one way or another. These days we operate as a workers' co-op, but still with volunteers. And we have some regular donations that are made to us, so we make a little bit of money to cover our costs. But yeah, that question of it being about people's interest and dedication to the kind of ideal, first and foremost, is an interesting question, right? Because I mean, yeah, we see this in activist organisations all the time. The pull between wanting to find money to pay your people and not wanting all your work to be fundraising to find money to pay your people to do more fundraising work to keep paying themselves and not actually do any of the valuable stuff that you want to be doing. Yeah, that was a bit of an idea splurge, but I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about that, either historical or current.
I guess my feelings are, when we set, I guess the beauty of the Norwich Radical when I was involved is it was run by people who didn't really know what they were doing. It got people to write for us who didn't really know what they were doing, and gave them the scope and experience and freedom to do that stuff. Now, I know that, some people listening to that will say, so, should artists just be paid for their exposure rather than for their labour? And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that, we were specifically, essentially, a student organisation at first, run largely by students or very recently not students. Most of our writers were students, and it was intentionally a volunteer run thing, and that was part of the beauty of it. Now, my view is it's not a surprise that lots of the people that came through the Radical have gone on to do loads of other stuff in journalism and in left media since. And to my mind, when me and Cadi founded it, if we suddenly found ourselves with £1 million to start paying 10 staff writers for a year, we wouldn't have hired the same people. We would have hired people who had got backgrounds and experience in journalism. We wouldn't have been getting our mates to write things, people who'd not written anything before. And that came with its disadvantages because, some of the stuff that we published at the start, go back and read it, some of it's shit, some of the stuff that I wrote was shit, some of the stuff that we wrote was, perhaps not as legally sound as it ought to have been. But maybe we won't go there on this call. But yeah, to me, that was a really valuable thing that, there's a bunch of people who got their first, experience of doing digital journalism and writing and reporting and commentating and translating and poetry and all the rest of it that I don't think would have had that same experience if it was on a model where we were basically hiring staff writers and paying people, and the fact that everyone wasn't paid kind of made it what it was, I think.
Yeah, and just to kind of agree and add to Chris there, we set this up, but we didn't necessarily have, we had experience in sort of activism and community building, etc. But we'd never run a publication before. We'd never done anything like that. So I gained as much experience around how to, organize staff teams. It was kind of like my first experience into people management, etc. Also around editing. The first paid job I had coming out of university was in editing, and that definitely was directly benefited from the fact that I could point to my experience of learning to edit a bunch of people who, they had amazing things to say, but they didn't necessarily know how to say it in a way that was going to land for a general readership. So, I feel like we were gaining as much experience at the time as well. And when, if you look at the way in which Chris and I wrote, also the way that, we edited over time, that moved, as much as anything else as well. So it was quite a reciprocal relationship. It's the first time I'd ever, created a website. Lost some sleepless nights over trying to do little bits of code to get these to not do the things that they were doing, etc. Like it was a really grassroots space. And I really agree with Chris about, yes, people shouldn't just have exposure, they should be paid, but it really was all of us in this together. Chris and I weren't benefiting in any different way, none of the editors were. There was experience for all of us, and what was bringing us together was, a desire to do it collectively, with maybe a dream of, it being something. And it's one of the reasons why I love where you guys got it to in terms of having a structure and being a workers cooperative. That wasn't something that Chris and I managed to do in the time that we were co-editing it, but it's been part of its journey as well.
I think full credit to Rowan for taking literally every single lead on that process. Because I was, by that point, I was living in Italy and like moving around between different countries, and just trying to figure out what I was doing after academia had burned me out, which is what happens when you do 16 years of straight education. Never do that. Like they say, if you can afford to take a break in the middle of academia, please take a break at some point in the middle of academic studies. And don't go into academic teaching, especially not in the UK or the US. Just don't. Just burn it all down. But not the libraries. Keep the libraries open. But yes, Rowan was crucial and essential to the entire process, and that is how we split the labor behind the scenes as well. There's like Rowan is very much the organizing agendas, setting up the paperwork processes, and I'm more on the advertising, social media, and getting the contacts with some of the older writers and getting some of the reaching out to other people. Some of those tasks do cross over, but there is a initially organic, eventually codified distinction in the different tasks that we take on for the editing. And then the editing is just split equally between us, as it always has been. Like each section used to have an editor, and the editors were referred to the co-editors. And then it just became it's just a 2-people team, so we just split it half and half, or whoever has the most time gets to do one more than the other.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things I could pick up on there, but I think I'll pick up on editing, because when I joined the Radical, I was a philosophy student, so I did a lot of writing for my degree, but also I had done a little bit of copywriting. I'm a little bit of a Nepo baby in that respect. My aunt ran a marketing agency in London, and she got me my first work in that industry. So I've been doing some copywriting, editing stuff. So I had a bit of experience, but it was really a really valuable thing. So I was this editor of the student section when I started, as I was a recent graduate at the time. That was a really valuable thing, I think, both in terms of experience for just editing the mechanics of it, of handling language and so on, but also that kind of mentoring relationship that you have with writers who, as you say, Cadi, were not necessarily hugely experienced or, well versed in using the written word in that way. And that's, I think, some of the most valuable and fulfilling work I've done with the Radical has been working with new writers and taking them from, you've got a couple of thousand words on a page and I don't really know what you're trying to say, to this is something that's really readable, really powerful and evocative, and is, now available to an audience via our site, smaller than that audience sometimes is. And I've we've received a lot of feedback of gratitude from people that we've worked with in that way over the years, which has been really, delightful. So yeah, I think that in itself is almost. Sometimes I think that's the work. That's the work. If I were to put it into one sentence of what good has the Norwich Radical done in 10 years, is that it's made a bunch of writers who wouldn't have had those skills otherwise, by giving them a platform.
So I guess picking up on what Cadi and Chris have been saying, and picking up on like what Rowan has started alluding to, and I've mentioned very erratically, as my brain seems to be doing things these days. This is a question to Rowan, which is kind of silly because we meet weekly and we have this conversation regularly, but no one else hears those conversations. So Cadi and Chris mentioned how, like, what the environment was for the beginning of the Radical and how it, like, developed, like, the big first War of Words, the first idea of, like, reaching out to people who they knew would be interesting voices to hear about on certain topics, and it would be topics that the writers would choose. And then how the way that you phrased it in the question that I'm now posing to you is, how do you see it now in a completely different media and political context? Like, what is the Radical doing now compared to what it started out as doing back in 2014?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, right? Because I do work in media reform campaigning space. At the moment, I've been doing for a few years. And so this question of, I see a lot of different projects, independent media projects being run by different people around the country in all sorts of different forms. And I've been talking to a lot of those people through the course of my work. So yeah, that's something I think quite a lot. And I guess on Monday I was at the not to date when we're recording this, but on Monday I was at the May Day fair at Cow Tower, which people may know. A bunch of people get together, put up a maypole, have some song and dance and stalls for various people to sell things and promote things or what have you. And we've had a stall there the past couple of years, so I borrowed a wallpaper table and set up a little stall. And obviously, at some point when you're running a stall like that, you get into a pattern and you have a kind of pitch, right? And people would come up to me and I'd say, "Have you heard of the Norwich Radical?" And some of them would say yes, which is quite gratifying, but most of them would say no. And I would say, well, nowadays my pitch is we're kind of an online magazine and we publish local and international writers who are all volunteers writing about various topics related to politics and the arts from a kind of progressive left-wing perspective. And that I think at the time it was founded, the idea of a blog was an idea that people still kind of knew about and put some weight in. That it was like there was more of a lens for understanding just a website that had writing on it that you might go to, in a way that the internet doesn't really work like that anymore for a lot of people. It's everything's mediated through the big platforms by design, and as a rule, the websites that are running independently of those platforms are kind of beholden to trying to jump through SEO hoops and do various other things to get in front of readers. And so I think one of the ways that things have changed for us is that the idea that we would publish a bunch of things over a month, just over the course of whenever they were ready, they'd get published. We'd schedule them for ourselves, but for the most part, how we used to publish things was we would publish them whenever they were ready. And that they would probably find some amount of audience just because the way that social media worked at the time was coherent with that strategy. Nowadays, the idea that you're just publishing pieces of writing on the internet that people might come and read, and you're not trying to do, a big newsletter drive, or you're not trying to make it into some kind of other campaign. It's just kind of a little bit of a non-starter, I feel. So part of the way we've changed is in our publishing model, right? And I think that's a reaction to that change in media context. But also it's a change in terms of what we do and where we sit, and that the core principle I've always held on to is that principle that one of you mentioned of wanting to be a place for people to say things that they wouldn't be able to say elsewhere, either because they don't have the writing experience to get picked up by other platforms, or because it's politically or socially or for whatever reason the kind of thing that doesn't get platformed very often, or perhaps because it's a writer from a marginalised background, for example. So that's kind of the principle I feel that we've held true to, and that has kept us in a space that differentiates us from a lot of other independent media organisations who are either trying to fill the void left by failing local news and provide an actual news service, which is not really something we do, or they're trying to do a more large-scale and kind of political effort to kind of create a kind of a left-wing, like a more widely heard left-wing voice in that will break into mainstream media and occasionally in the way that Navarra do, for example. And what we are still really in our corner being a space for people to come and say cool and interesting stuff, and for other people to come and read that cool and interesting stuff if we can find a way to get it in front of them. But not necessarily trying to grow into anything, larger scale or domineering, or to try and, again, fill the void being left by mainstream media. We're still doing the thing that we find interesting and cool and want other people to encounter, irrespective of whether publishing written content on the internet is a thing that makes any sense for any kind of business reasons these days, which increasingly it seems that it doesn't.
I think
so a long-winded answer to your question.
And I think just what you're touching on there, Rowan, which I really value, is that, over the 10 years and the changing media and political landscape that has happened in those 10 years, we haven't lost, or we've made the conscious choice, whoever is editing The Radical made the conscious choice to keep with our values and what we cared about, and they haven't tried to become something that either we, weren't equipped for in terms of time, or that we didn't want to become. We haven't sold out in terms of just deciding to, write about anything or become clickbaity. We could have become, much more, clickbaity if we wanted to. We could have done this, we could have done that. Actually, what we continued and what you have continued it to be is a space for those voices and for that kind of, the what of what is being talked about. We're still talking about, if you look on the Radicals, page right now and have a look at the articles that have been published recently, it's still the things, that we want to give and you want to give voice to. And I think, that's what I really admire in how, you and Alex have continued this forward, and is you've had to strike that balance between it being a realistic thing to have in your lives, in addition to everything else that you have, but also ensuring that it is still the thing that, you care about in terms of the ideals.
Yeah, I think another thing is that although the kind of the things we do and the way we do them have changed a bit in terms of their practical form, particularly locally, the need for an alternative publication is still very much evident. Like, even though we're not publishing as regularly, and I guess at the time, because I was moving in student circles a lot more, it felt like The Radical was a kind of a high-profile deal in the city. And I don't know if that's less true now, or if that was just always my perception, being biased by the fact of being a student and things always feel much bigger and more important. But at any rate, nonetheless, even though we're a relatively small publication, we don't do anything like the kind of reach that the EDP does and other local.
We also don't have like a parent company that runs 25 different magazines in the region and the country. So and we still produce some. And we still produce better writing than them in many cases, I think. But we do also find that, so in a couple of cases, we've done some reporting that has been really needed locally that other people weren't going to do. Even in the last couple of years, we ran a big feature on the financial crisis at the UEA last year, in which the management seemed to manage to lose 30 million quid and decide they weren't going to tell anyone about it until 6 months before they were all going to lose their jobs, which, as someone who also has a job at the UEA, was a bit of a nightmare. So I was glad we were able to publish that, and it got a lot of traffic. People, again, it was covering local issues that just aren't being covered by the other local press, and that was really useful. And even just recently, with a Green councillor reached out to us, Hannah Hockner, to write about how the council has like really poorly and frankly farcically handled people protesting about their failure to commit to a stance on the side of the people of Gaza. And Hannah felt she needed to reach out to us because there was nowhere else in the press to go. The council weren't listening to her. She wanted to publish something to put their feet to the fire, and we were the place she had to go. And that's, while slightly depressing, given that, yes, once upon a time, most cities in this country would have had an actually reasonable local newspaper that went into councils and did some actual, transparency reporting. It's good that we can provide that for a city that still needs it, I think.
Yeah, and I also think, especially back in the day, and I credit Chris for this, and I bet he's made a career out of it as well, but the kind of political coverage that we did, especially back in the early days, in terms of who we managed to sport interviews with. I mean, you talked to your own about the fact that your second article was, interviewing Natalie Bennett. The articles that Chris managed to get coverage from in terms of, not just the Green Party, but in terms of the Labour Party, as well, with various kind of elections. At the time, I wasn't really, anybody asking those types of questions, when it came to election coverage. And yes, there are, debates of, Bright Green and Navarra, etc. now, but at the time, I think we were willing to just give it a go and, ask people if they talk to us. And it, in many ways, probably, whether unconsciously or not, is what has made people reach out in the years preceding to say, can I write this? Can I contribute this piece as well? Because there's a real range of what we have in Iraqis.
And I think that is one of the things that stands out about the Norwich Radical specifically, is that we've always had in our statement, in our agenda, in our vision, strategic visions and non-strategic visions, they do have a very, I'm going to say fond memories, but they weren't fond at the time, of the away days that Chris would force us on to. We would spend an entire day just arguing about how to write a specific sentence, which was great. Love to have the time to be able to do this again. It's just no longer feasible. And as Chris was saying, like, we were all students or around student life, or being around like the time where you have that time, and that is the one thing that is taking up most of the time in your life. You don't have. I don't think a project like this would be feasible to begin today. I don't think anyone would have the capacity, be it monetary, be it time-wise, be it even just energy-wise. There is just so much energy is being put towards, surviving. I don't think there would be quite enough. The scope is very much there. Like, that's the thing we've been saying all the way through this conversation, is like, the scope, the need for it is there. No one has the means for it anymore. And that's why having something that already exists that can provide that outlet, that platform, I don't quite like the word platform anymore quite as much as I used to one time, but being there, having that space be available to people who need to have that space, is the reason that we're still around 10 years later, and we're not panicking about not being able to write more, not being able to publish more, not being able to spotlight more writing and writers.
I mean, the other side of that is that we're all 10 years older, right? And that, like, it's hard for us now to imagine doing what we did 10 years ago as students. And that I'm sure, given the desire for a written platform that didn't exist, pardon, I've used the word platform immediately after your criticism of it, but a desire for that outlet among younger people with more time, maybe that would spring up spontaneously if we didn't exist. It's hard to say. I mean, I do think, not to get too in the weeds on this, but I do think the format, the kind of written articles format, is actually the thing that would be less likely to be done now. The way that people would find those places to explore would be in other media and in other other online formats as well.
I don't want to look down or dismiss, like, young activism has proven time and time again, like 10 years ago with us, 10 years later with everything currently happening on university campuses around the world, like, the kids are all right. It's dating me. I'm almost 40 at this point. It's weird. It's uncomfortable. I'm not quite there yet, but it is. I am the closest
Alex.
to 40 out of all of us.
Yeah.
I'm realizing that we're approaching having been on for an hour now, so we should probably start to wrap up. But to finish, I was, I guess the obvious thing is to talk about the future, right? I mean, I'm keen to, if anyone has any other kind of highlights of the past 10 years that they particularly like to throw in, please do. Shall we go around one at a time and talk about maybe how we feel about either the future of the Radical or the future of the kind of political ideals that the Radical represents, and the kind of work that you hear and that other people do in other places. And I realise I've slightly sprung that question on you all, so I'm going to throw it to Alex first, because I feel most entitled to throw him difficult questions.
Thank you. I think it follows on quite neatly from what I was saying about, younger generation of activism, younger generation of writers, younger generation of, I'm going to use the word content creator, but what I mean is artists, writers, performers, poets, musicians, like people who create art that is politically engaged and are engaged in politics, even if they don't realize how much it is influencing their art and their writing, is very much there. And I think there is a resurgence. There is not really a resurgence. There's a fanning of the fires that seemed dormant in the past, like maybe 5 years. I see it mostly like living where I live now. I see it mostly in like North American contexts. I see it mostly back in Italy, where a lot of things are happening politically, and it is mostly the younger second, third generation Italians who still don't have citizenship, like they didn't have 10 years ago. But that's the one thing that I keep talking about in everything I've ever written about Italy, is that it's not doing great, and there's fewer and fewer Italians because no one is allowed to become an Italian anymore unless you're born from 75 generations of white people. Is encouraging, and it's frustrating that everyone is being radicalized through doom rather than being radicalized through like the positive way that radicalization can bring. And it's something that I think I've mentioned in a couple of newsletters around the turn of the year. There's a great book by Mariame Kaba, and I don't remember her co-writer. It literally Let This Radicalize You, which I do recommend, and it is aimed at the younger generation of writers. And I think that's what I'm hoping that this new but not original push for political art and politics is going, is maybe in different directions than the written form, as Rowan, you were saying, but it's there. It's not gone. It's not doom and gloom. It's striving to make the world a better place, or at least save what is good about the world, and not making it entirely like, well, there's no point. No, there is a point. There are many points, and people are finding those points and making them loud and clear. And I'm gonna put Chris on the spot.
Thanks. I guess before that, Rowan, you invited us to reflect on a thing from the years that we didn't manage to pick up. So I'm going to do that, which is one of the things that I think embodied the spirit of the Norwich Radical, of all the things that I wrote, best, which was the coverage you did of the closure of the Owl Sanctuary, which listeners who are of a younger disposition than we are, was a music venue in Norwich many moons ago, which was closed. Initially, landlord, the property owner evicted them without notice in order to redevelop their site. That then closed the second time in a new location. But for me, that embodied a lot. Our coverage of that embodied a lot of why, as a publication, it was so valuable at the time. One, because it was that specific blending of politics and the arts, which you weren't getting from elsewhere. So obviously the EDP or the Norwich Evening News, whatever, reported on the closure, but it didn't report on the closure in the context of a process of gentrification. It didn't report on it in terms of the value of that as a specific space, and only we would have done that. The second thing, obviously, was that it was a specifically Norwich-oriented thing. We were doing local coverage, and it struck a real nerve with people locally in the city and artists and musicians elsewhere, because it was a trend that was identified by them. And I was really proud of writing some of our coverage of that. I know that Sarah also went on to write more on it later, but I think at the time, you'll have the latest figures, but I think it was the second or third most read article we published for quite a few years. And so I that's one thing I'm really proud of. People listening, go back and read that coverage, because I think it was really good. In terms of the future and where Norwich Radical sits, I think, so we may or may not know, but I work in the alternative media spaces at the moment. And I think, in the 10 or so years I've been doing that, I think a lot of what Rowan said is true about where media is going. I think for me, the context in which Norwich Radical was set up versus the context it's in now is completely different in many ways. Some of it is technological, the way that social media platforms have changed, making it harder for outlets like the Norwich Radical, which are both small, radical, and poor, and based on the written word, very, very hard to break through. I think that we've also seen the growth of other alternative and left-wing outlets, whether it be Novara, the Canary, Left for Forward, where I work, other places that people have mentioned. Politics Joe, there's a bunch of new outlets that's a much wider progressive ecosystem than there was in 2014. Although, sadly, we've just seen Open Democracy facing a massive round of redundancies in the last week. So, it's not all rosy. We're also seeing, sadly, the growth of alternative right-wing media platforms with a lot more money behind them, obviously the likes of GB News and Talk TV and the likes. It's a very different landscape, but one thing that I think hasn't changed is that there still remains that need for a geographically anchored, locally rooted progressive voice. We no longer have the privilege of living in Norwich, but as someone who lives in Oxford, I would very much love to have a similar platform that you guys have in Norwich over here, because that voice and that space is missing, and it diminishes the strength of our social movements, it diminishes the strength of the left. And so for me, the strength and the beauty of the Norwich Radical today is that it's kept that local orientation towards Norwich, and the stuff that you were describing about, that accountability for the city council on Gaza is really, really important, and no one else will do that. And so that, for me, is central to its future as an outsider now. Cadi, your turn.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll just do a quick reflection on something content-wise from the archives as well. I was more an editor than a writer, and this was when I wasn't living, I think I might even be living overseas at the time. I think it was around 2017, and the Norwich Radical broke the news on UEA divesting from fossil fuels, and as a student who had been at UEA and had probably, with all of you on this call at various points, taken over various vice-chancellor offices, erected various cardboard constructions. There's a solid picture in the background that Chris has. Being involved in that practical activism and then moved away from the city, being able to, in the midst of just, we'd had Brexit, we'd had this, all of this kind of onslaught of kind of negative news that is out there because we're living in, just very difficult times. Having the Radical being able to break the news of something positive that was local, that was really at the heart of the community of the Norwich Radical, which is the people, especially in those early days, the majority of people writing for the Norwich Radical, were either students studying at UEA or they were local people living in Norwich. And it felt like a full circle moment for me to see the Radical being able to, kind of break the news on that one. And that kind of leads me a little bit to the, reflections on the future, which is, the landscape is very different. Social media is very different. Most people get their, news and, opinions and thoughts from, TikTok and 30-second videos, etc., which absolutely, kind of have their spaces and have their places. But what I really value with the Radical is that it has maintained its written form as well. It hasn't tried to become something different. It gives people that longer space to reflect, to have their voice, and if you looked at sort of 10 years, even 10 years time to now, if there are still things being published and voices, having that space, that feels really, powerful to me. And I think as an opportunity for the Radical in continuing to provide that more nuanced space for the written form, for art, in a world that's constantly adapting and moving away. Yes, adaptation is important, but I also think it's important that we don't lose things like the written form, and we don't lose things like art, and we don't just jump to the next ship and find the next thing. If we're not out to if we're not out for world domination, which we're absolutely not, then it's finding what are our roots, what we care about, and I really hope that the Radical continues to be a space for people to be able to read really important reflection towards people who have something to say, whether it's personal stories We've had personal reflections over the years from, individuals who have experienced physical disabilities, mental health, kind of experiencing her life. We've had personal stories as much as we've had political critiques and conversations. And I think the fact that that continues to exist in a world which, yes, there is a lot more black domination, like Chris said, we have got more right-wing media out there now. From a social media perspective, we have, a much faster world. Information is bite-sized, this, that, the other. And I think change is important, but I hope for the Radical that it continues to hold true to give people the space. It's not writing in 150 characters. It's not doing in a 30-something and it's here is a space. I'm thinking defaulted to space instead of platform, and a reflection of the web platform. But here is a space. What do you want to say? And actually, what people have said over the last 10 years on the Radical is really admirable.
Yeah, I suppose that leaves it to me to finish up. So I would just say that, underline again that I think it really is still needed, and that for a space for the passion for and interest in writing and reading on the internet in the kind of form that we work in, but also that local connection for being a space for local accountability journalism and other work of that kind, and for the combined perspective, political and artistic, that the Radicals always stood for. I think all those things are all very much still needed, and also that thing that I said before of passing on skills, providing training and mentorship to people who want to work with words who wouldn't necessarily find a way into that. We provide quite a fair amount of mentoring and experience over the years. We have done for free, and we're very happy to be able to do that. So that's something else that we'll be continuing to do. I guess keep watching this space, and we'll still be here doing our thing for a good while yet. Another 10 years, maybe not, we'll see, but at least a little while. Unless there's anything else from you, Alex, I think we can wrap this up.
No, I think we can most definitely wrap that up. It's been good to see everyone's faces and hear everyone's voices. I think we are now covering most of the Northern Hemisphere, just by virtue of our roots are in Norwich, and it started out in Norwich, and everyone has ties to Norwich. I believe Rowan is the only one who is actually actively living in Norwich, although is not joining us from Norwich today.
I'm wearing the t-shirt though,
wearing the t-shirt.
You suckers are.
Thank you. Mine is in the wash. But I think it's fascinating to me how we keep going back to the not only thinking globally, acting locally, but also acting globally, and acting locally just keeps being the same thing. Just going back to what Chris was pointing out of having that anchored root in a local politics, local events, local art scene, local scene in general, with an eye to everything and keeping in mind how everything is connected. And that's I also hope we never lose that with the Norwich Radical. So thank you all for joining us for the chat, and thank you all for all of those of you, those 35 people out there who are listening. I'm being optimistic here with 35, might be 32 listening.
5,000 was that, Alex?
Yes, I'm using there's a silent K after it.
Cool.
Listening, watching, however way you come across this, and you can find us at the norwichradical.com. We are a non-profit, volunteer-run organization, magazine, which offers a progressive analysis of politics and the arts.